Okay, I think we made it live. Thank you all who are tuning in today. I'm Emily. I'm the artistic producer at Actors Theater of Louisville. And today our unscripted is on Which Side Are You On? Working Class Hillbillies for Black Lives. This is a weekly conversation hosted by Actors Theater. All donations are shared with La Casita. A little bit about them. La Casita is a grassroots nonprofit right here in Louisville, supporting families in the Latinx community while providing a foundation for systemic change with long-term effects. So if you're able to give today, know that part of your support will also be supporting them. So thank you for that. Unscripted is truly an unscripted conversation, which is what we're going to have here today. And I just want to start out, if you all would tell us who you are and who your people are. Beth, could we start with you?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. My name is Beth Howard. I live in Lexington, Kentucky, and I'm from Eastern Kentucky, Morgan County, Kentucky. I grew up in a small community called Blaze. It was about a 1.5 lane road to drive through it. And I grew up on a small tobacco farm that was a family farm. My mother worked in a grocery store and later a factory. My dad was a surface miner, strip miner, and also often unemployed. And both of them worked until they physically could not work anymore. And so through all of that, I would say like it really has shaped my understanding of the political analysis I have and has brought me here today. And I would say like the other people in my life who I would call my people are like Michael and Josh and all of us who are doing this work across the South and Appalachia.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. All right, let's go to Josh.
Hey, everybody. Josh Poe. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm with the Root Cause Research Center. It was an organization started by myself and Jessica Bellamy. And I'm too, and from Eastern Kentucky, from Robertson County. And also grew up on a small tobacco farm. I grew up on my grandparents' tobacco farm and, worked in tobacco as an early age as I can remember. I actually, grew up in the tobacco fields. And so, from there, I was raised by my grandparents. My grandparents were sharecroppers and were able to get land in the, 30s or 40s or 50s, I guess. And just sort of very radicalized by that process and radicalized by countering, or rather the need to counter the narrative that poor people were somehow the architects of their own situation, and countering the narrative that poor communities are pathologized as lacking, the ability to supervise themselves or be responsible. And so got into organizing in my late teens, early 20s, and, really got involved in housing justice organizing and just sort of developed a political analysis around race and class. Later on, I went to Berea College and ended up going to graduate school at U of L. And became an urban planner and a geographer. And so, radical geography, particularly Black radical geography, really helped me develop my political understanding. And I think the work of Black radical geographers really helped me understand where I was from in Eastern Kentucky and seeing issues through the lens of a material analysis and material resources rather than this sort of veil of liberalism that we have so often. Oh, and my people are poor people, and I just want to say I've got so much love for the other two people on this panel. It's a real honor to be next to them here.
All right, thank you, Michael.
Hey, everybody. My name is Michael. I am a union worker with Workers United. And my people are from, I grew up in deep poverty in East Tennessee, where the Great Smoky Mountains is. So a lot of folks from up here kind of know where I'm from because they go and visit the park down there or go to Gatlinburg or something like that. And I've moved to Kentucky 12 years ago to go to Berea College. And the model of that school is to give education scholarships to poor Appalachians and folks from across the region, so that you can get a good education, and not go into a lot of debt over it. And my since graduating, I've kind of stuck around, so I'm calling in from Berea, Kentucky, today. And just the other, people I consider my people are like the folks on this call. Some of the folks that got me a lot more politically, I would say, focused. So shout out to my friends Alicia and Sasha. They definitely helped me get a lot more focused in the work that I do, because I've been very angry, and been filled with a lot of rage over stuff that we would go through in our lives and stuff that was tough or something like that. It just really ticked me off, because I didn't think it was right what we were having to go through, but I wasn't able to like translate a lot of that anger into like starting to do things that felt meaningful, until I started talking to folks who were like, yeah, you've got every right to be angry, but what you really want to do is like use that anger to like get you involved for fighting for rights for poor people.
Thank you all. Glad to be with you. Thank you. And those of us who are joining on Facebook, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. But we have a couple questions. And I'm going to start with this quote by Kevin D. Williamson. If you spend time in hardscrabble, white upstate New York, or Eastern Kentucky, or my own native West Texas, and you take an honest look at the welfare dependency, the drug and alcohol addiction, the family anarchy, which is to say the whelping of human children with all the respect and wisdom of a stray dog, you will come to an awful realization. Nothing happened to them. There wasn't some awful disaster. The truth about these dysfunctional, downscale communities is that they deserve to die. So in sharing that and in sharing this next question, if we could just use that to start off the conversation. So how did you, and you've shared a little bit of this already, but how did you come to understand class solidarity and the mutual interest of poor working class white folks, Black folks, and people of color, especially here in Kentucky, in solidarity with Black Lives Matter Louisville?
I'll start out. And I forgot to say, this is the issue with going first, is you forget things and other people remind you. But I've been a community organizer for 15 years. And right now I am the organizing director for an organization called Southern Crossroads, which is doing this kind of work of building multiracial solidarity of working class and poor folks across the South and Appalachia. But I came to this work and this understanding because I was also very angry about the way I grew up and the circumstances in my life and in the life of my community and my people. And also like that quote is a very like telling description of the way people saw us and still view us and the way we're treated and the way we're seen as disposable. And so I was really angry about that, but I didn't have that full picture. And so when I started to get into community organizing, they really like brought me in because they were like, this girl's angry. And I had every right to be. And so then I started to be able to look, to start to get away from like the individual harms that were caused to me, like this person hurt me, or this boss laid off my dad, or if this thing had not happened to my mother, that's due to this person or this like employer, then we wouldn't have had these situations happen. And it allowed me to start to look at like, this is all part of a system that is designed to like kill us. And so, so a few people can be rich basically. But the way I really came to understand like class solidarity and thinking about myself as a working class person from Eastern Kentucky and being in solidarity with Black Lives Matter Louisville and in the movement for Black Lives is because I started to do really deep work a couple of years ago of looking at my family, our ancestry, our lineage. And, we were looking at family records, and I noticed that there were two things happening that I could find. One was I couldn't really find anything because we didn't matter enough. Like, we literally did not matter, that like we didn't even register unless it was a death record, or like, family members, a few that served in the military. Or I had like a couple families or family members who were street cleaners in the New Deal. And so there were just like census records, but just hardly anything about us. But a lot of the information I was able to find around like death records were like these brutal deaths from capitalism, from a system that just exploits people in their labor and their lives, and leaves them with nothing. And so I really then also started to see that as a part of racialized capitalism, and knowing that like my people, poor white people, working class white people, especially in Appalachia, where I'm from, so really looking at my place in it and my people's place in it, that machine cannot function without poor white people being a huge part of it because of our labor, but also making sure that we never, ever come into true solidarity with Black folks or people of color, because if we were to do that, we would win. We could overthrow everything. And so just knowing that, and that poor white people's role in that was killing my family, and it was killing like the people I love in my community, and also Black people, and a lot of us. And so I wanted, I kind of made a commitment to myself that I was willing to do whatever I needed to do to break up my piece of that machine within myself and within like our people, and doing this kind of work. And so, when we called the panel, like, whose side are you on? And I think that's really the question that we are asking our people, and that we've asked ourselves, and we've chosen our side, which is to be in solidarity in defending Black lives. But what's beautiful about that song and that kind of movement is that that song was written from a union leader's wife in Harlan County, Kentucky, in coal fields. And we also hear that on the streets of Black Lives Matter today, and in the protests, in the movement work today. And so that's the kind of solidarity that I'm committed to, and that's how I came to that understanding.
Thank you, Beth. All right, Michael, Josh, does one of you want to jump in next?
Sure, I'll jump in next. And in thinking about that quote, well, first of all, thank you, Beth. That's a really amazing telling of not just your personal experience, but what kind of where we want to go with this panel. But with in thinking about that quote, that's a vicious quote, right? And it's published in the National Review. And it's important that we see that quote in terms of public policy, because articles like that have a political motivation to really shape public policy. And so what does it mean to say that that people, like certain communities deserve to die? What does it mean to say that nothing happened to them? They are solely the architects of their own condition. And I think what you have now in Eastern Kentucky is a narrative that's been crafted and developed to vilify people for exploitation and extraction. And and we basically have a surplus population where people in Eastern Kentucky are no longer economically useful, right? Coal is gone, tobacco's gone. And so within capitalism, when we have surplus population, we craft narratives and we develop social management systems around that population. And typically, that's been done with Black communities for decades, right? That quote reminds me of a lot of the quotes you find in the redlining documents from the 30s about Black communities. And so that social management system, largely takes the form of prison industrial complex, military industrial complex, and the nonprofit industrial complex. And so now you have nonprofits, running to Appalachia like there's a gold mine there in programming, because you have this huge population of unemployed people who are some of the poorest people in the country. And so the job of nonprofits is to really provide the illusion that something is being done about that. But it's also the job of people like the National Review and J.D. Vance to vilify us to the point that people don't care about what happens to us. And I think that's the political narrative and public policy that's come out of that quote. because quite simply within neoliberalism, there's no safety net for poor people anymore. And we will die. We will become homeless. We will die, in violent deaths at the hands of the police, in prisons, and on the streets of our cities. And so that's really the only option that we have. And so in thinking about class solidarity in my own life, I didn't really understand class for a long time. And so one of the things we don't talk about a lot is class segregation. And I didn't realize that I grew up like a highly segregated community by class. I didn't actually enter middle class spaces until I was in my late 20s, really when I went to Berea College and went home with some students who kind of like snuck into Berea College and lied about their income. And so I kind of was exposed to middle class spaces very late in life. Now I was exposed to them through labor because my grandmother cleaned houses and I worked as a carpenter. So I worked for middle class people, but actually, being in middle class spaces as an equal was not something I experienced until in my late 20s. And I did so largely through working for nonprofits, right? And so when I started working for nonprofits, I realized that the way we're explaining whiteness was not a very good explanation. And so I was kind of lumped in as a white person with other white people without really developing solid class identities. And within those spaces, I wasn't always showing up under respectability politics. And so what ended up happening is I kind of gravitated toward radical Black spaces without really knowing why, but looking back on that now, it's because we shared the same class interest. And so if we had solid class identities in those spaces, we'd be able to kind of sort out, okay, this group of people, has a particular political lens because they grew up in households that made over $120,000 a year. And this group of people, has a political analysis which they grew up in households that made under $20,000 a year, right? And so we're not able to see that everyone's actually acting in their class interest in those spaces. And what ended up happening to me, because I didn't have that analysis, I had, hella imposter syndrome. I was marginalized as being too radical and kind of lumped in with this group of people like, well, they're too radical. They want to burn everything down, when actually our class interest was very different than people who grew up in houses that made six figures. And that's one of the problems that the left has, is we kind of lump everyone in together without really identifying where we all stand on the political spectrum.
Michael, anything that you want to add before we go on to the next question?
Yeah, just kind of want to add, when I hear things like this quote, like, it's really tough to sit with, because it's not just that, like, oh, people deserve to die, so it's like they're going to die, and that's what should happen in those communities. Like, people already are, and they have names, and they have families, and there are a lot of our family members, like, who aren't with us today because of like illnesses that are directly caused by capitalism, and that are metered out as the collateral damage of, this is what it takes to generate profit for a few people to be exorbitantly wealthy, and this is what has to happen so that like this whole machine can function. So to say that like there are people who deserve to die so that Jeff Bezos could have more money than anybody's ever had on planet Earth is like, what I hear is you're saying that my mama deserved to die, and the life that she lived was what was her due because of it was their fault, and she should have died. Like, that's very personal to me, because it feels like you're pointing the finger at like the people I care about most in my life, and saying they had it coming, and I'm glad they're dead. So like the brutality of that is rare to see it stated like that, but this whole entire economy in this state and in this country and around the world like, we should actually be thankful, because this actually puts it into words. This is how we behave every single day of our lives, in the way that we treat workers, in the way that we treat the poor, but we don't name it for what it is. So at least this person's coming out and just calling it like it is, because this is the system that we have. We do it on purpose. We kill communities so that a few people can be exorbitantly rich, and it's just vile. And it's what brought me to an understanding of, like, what it means to have class solidarity, because, like, when you hear stuff like that, it should piss you off. Like, you should be mad about that. And I started to realize, like, I have every right to be mad about that. And I would start listening to other folks telling their stories about what was going on in their community, and saying, like, there's police brutality in our communities, and we're being over policed in Black neighborhoods and stuff like that, and that's not right. And we have every right to be mad about that, and demand that our dignity is more important than keeping this system running the way that it's going. And even though I don't share that exact same experience, because I'm a white person in Kentucky, there are things about listening and hearing folks speak honestly and directly about, this is what it's like to live in Kentucky as a Black person. There are things about that that resonate with me, that I can see, like, well, yeah, that system is, this is how it's showing up in your life, and this is how it's showing up in my life. And actually, we're all doomed unless we can get together. But the beautiful fact is, if we were able to get together, we're powerful enough and strong enough and numerous enough to actually change that system and stop that from happening, and build something new and beautiful.
Yeah, thank you all so much. There's a couple of questions that have come in that I think are great follow-ups to all that's been said. And I'm going to group them together. What do you mean when we say solidarity? And in what way does that help those who are poor and or Black? And how can we encourage the groups to join forces?
I can take the one on meaning solidarity, because
Please.
it's gotten really common, and I heard this from Ashley Woodard Henderson, who's at the Highlander Center, being honest about, like, how easy it is, and I've done this, is be, oh, I'm in solidarity with these folks, and I'm in solidarity with these folks, and I'm in solidarity with these folks, and da 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 da, and then somebody being like, well, what do you do? And it's like, nothing. I said it. I said that. So good for me, I guess. But part of, like, what helped me understand solidarity a little bit more deeply is through union organizing, and trade unions and the labor movement, because what happens in a workplace when, like, the workers come together and decide, like, hey, I want to form a union, like, I think that we need that in this workplace. What you're asking folks to do is to sign a union card. And that process, it's actually one of the most proud things that I've ever done in the movement, is signing a union card, because what it does is it puts your money and your livelihood and your paycheck and all of these things, it puts all of that where your mouth is, and it forces you to do that. And if you're not prepared to do that, don't sign this union card. Like, and that's your choice if you want to sign it or not. But if you're not prepared to, like, actually put it on the line and say, I'm going to cast my lot, my family's groceries, my rent money, my ability to pay for my prescription medication, I'm going to put it on the line, because what we have in this workplace is the right to have democratic participation and labor power that says we are co-equals with management on determining how our economic destinies are going to play out here as employees. Like, I believe that so strongly that I'm willing to put it on the line and risk it all, to join a union. And people do that every day in unions. Fast food workers, you'll hear so many stories, like, from folks in the 5 for 15 and stuff like that, that have advocated in their workplaces for unions and have been met with retaliation. Like, it's very serious and very real. So when somebody is so meaningful, like that they live their solidarity based on what they do and they prove it to you.
Yeah, Josh, were you unmuting?
Yeah, that's a great explanation, and I
Yeah.
think that's a good place for me to talk about the research that I did on redlining a few years ago, and I basically, my conclusion in all that research on redlining is that the entire history of housing policy in this country was to destroy cross-racial solidarity in the labor movement and really separate people and really maximize production based on these produced identities, and really, kind of move a whole lot of people into the identity of whiteness, right? And really create this illusion around whiteness that we share some sort of solidarity based on complexion that doesn't really alter, as poor white people, doesn't really alter our material reality. W.E.B. Du Bois called that a mental wage, right? So it's a feeling of manufactured superiority that doesn't actually exist. We can't cash it at the bank, right? And so we're in solidarity based around whiteness. And sort of the way this works is, under capitalism, we can't have 100% employment. Not everybody can have a job, right? That's just a basic fundamental law of capitalism. And so since we can't have full unemployment, some of us don't want to starve. So we do things like sell drugs or participate in illegal activity. And, when we're basically put in cages for that, and we call that surplus population, right? And so we have this manufactured explanation around that, rather than an indictment of the system. We don't just turn on the nightly news every night and, they're like, hey, you guys, here are the fundamental contradictions of capitalism. We tell people that the reason we have poverty is a cultural flaw, and we make poverty synonymous with Black people, right? And that's why you have people like where I grew up who make $20,000, $30,000 a year, but claim that they're middle class, right? Because we want to look like we're middle class. We want to appear to be middle class. And that's what whiteness does. It gives us that illusion. And so going back to what Michael said, if we really participated in, say, organizing Walmart workers, organizing Amazon workers, as you bring people with deplorable politics into that struggle, they start to realize that their material interests are in solidarity with Black workers, right? And they also start to realize that the state will use the same type of violence against them that's used against Black people every day. And this whole artifice and illusion of whiteness just starts to erode. And that's why we don't have that type of organizing take place. We have an entire nonprofit industrial complex and a political apparatus and an education system to prevent that type of work from being done. And so the theory is really, there's not a solution. The struggle is the solution, right? By bringing poor white people into the struggle, the deplorable politics will start to erode. And I think, kind of the entire apparatus of white middle class liberalism is also to prevent that type of organizing from happening.
Yeah, so just everything they said, plus one. And I'll think about the question, or, kind of thinking about organizing and the question of like how, continuing what they're talking about how do we actually do this? And so I wanted to acknowledge that like none of this is new. Like we're building on so many people who have done this over time, and especially in the South. We mentioned some of those folks already, but there's such a rich like history of this. And so, the things I know about community organizing is that, like we've said, we have to work with the most impacted people by these systems that we live in. And so for us, that's working with poor white people in this moment around building true like solidarity between people. And so one of the things that we have to do, and this kind of goes into the choice of like calling this or calling ourselves hillbillies or like rednecks, is it's about, and we've said this word, dignity. That's one of the first things we have to do is build dignity within ourselves and with each other, because once we start to do that, those words have been hurled at us, or like that quote, to like make us think we're nothing, to degrade us, to call us stupid, to call us worthless. And the more you hear that, the more you start to believe it. And so part of organizing and organizing the most impacted people is to build dignity individually and collectively. And what that means is that, we start to get angry. And anger is a sign of saying, like, I matter, like I deserve things. My family deserves things. Black folks deserve things, right? We deserve a life. We deserve housing. We deserve safety and the determination and freedom to live our lives. And we also deserve joy. Like, I think there's just like this, like, how dare poor people enjoy anything? And so then once we have that, we start to see a lot of the harm that's been done, and we start to step up and we take risks and we put our asses on the line together. And we say, no more of this, like no more of this for me, and no more of this for everybody that's in my class, and everybody that's in this struggle. And so, that work of reclaiming who we are, reclaiming our worth, reclaiming our dignity, is to me how we start to also build a movement together. And I wanted to speak too about the importance of centering poor and working class people in our space. And Josh kind of talked about like class privileged people and being in middle class spaces, and liberal middle class spaces. And I just think our work is to really like center poor and working class people. And when we're talking to our people, it's to center poor and working class white people into anti-racism and into this type of work, class solidarity. Because when you start to take risks and you're building enough power to actually threaten the power structures, the right will always be organizing against you. And, it's always a battle, which means you have to give up privilege, you give up power. Your life becomes very, very uncomfortable. And so for poor and working class white people, it's like, well, what do we have to lose? We have everything to gain. But when we're like the center of this like struggle is based on people with class privilege, that's just much easier for them to be like, well, this kind of got hard, so I'm just gonna like bounce, right? Or just like, stop showing up to the organizing meetings, right? And so it's not saying that like we need everybody, right? We need all the people that we can get. This is about having mass amounts of people. And so it's not that anyone's like kept out of the space, but it's like, where is the center of gravity? Where are the funds? Who are the people being supported and lifted up? And, I say, and I think we all say that is poor and working class people across the board.
Yeah. And one of the like through lines that I'm picking up, Josh and Beth, of like what you all were saying is like, Beth, I really liked when you lifted up like, we deserve joy and we deserve dignity. Like one of the things that I talk to folks that are kind of like newly getting engaged or something, or like looking around at our communities and realizing like what's happening isn't right here, is like that you're showing me that you're drawing a line and saying, look, no more. Beyond this line, you're not crossing, and I'm not taking it anymore. I'm fed up. And then like deserving to take like dignity in that joy that we have. It's really important because there's going to be folks when the right shows up, they're going to say, yeah, you do deserve to have dignity. And the thing that you need to take dignity in is your race. You need to take your pride in being white. And that's what it is you should be proud of. So it's like, you might not have a pot to piss in, but at least you're not black. You might not have a pot to piss in, but at least you're not an immigrant. And all of those kind of things. There are folks who are out there that are going to offer that as like a solution. And then they'll be like, well, okay, why don't you have those things right now? You do deserve to have housing and this and this and this. Oh, it's actually because of like lazy people, like welfare queens that we know is a racial trope, or it's Jewish folks or something like that. All of these like wacky conspiracy theories that are nonsense. And I think Josh is hitting on something very right, is like we have to make sure to like be upfront about talking about race, and talking about religion in a way that says, look, yeah, you do have a boot to your neck. I'm not denying that, but the idea that the boot to your neck is because of like other people who are suffering and other working class people is nonsense. And the only solution that this person has offered you is not housing. It's not healthcare. It's not, you know, a day off so that you can go fishing with your kids and enjoy the Saturday. Like the thing that they're offering you is racial pride, and that doesn't like put food on the table for your kids. Like you can't cash race pride like at the bank. So just you can piss all over that because it's not worth the check that it's written on. And what you really do need to do is join in with those other folks who have a boot to their neck and a boot in their communities. Because if you all were to work together, you're strong enough to actually smash the wheel and rebuild this society in the way that works for all of you.
I think that's a really important point that Michael just hit on, because and I think it's important throughout, through the history of the country. In the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was an economic benefit to whiteness, mostly through labor unions. Black people were kept out of labor unions. And so white worker, the white middle class was really created because they got higher wages in those unions, whereas Black workers were kept in lower skilled positions and got lower wages. That's over with, right? So, I mean, the benefits of racism and white supremacy for poor white people have completely vanished. And now with the loss of manufacturing, the loss of coal, the law, just the entire economic collapse, there's nothing left there but this artifice of bullshit, right? And pseudoscience that's been constructed. And so how long are poor white people going to keep buying into that? And I think what we're talking about now is really the issues of visibility, recognition, and representation. And as poor white people in Kentucky, East Tennessee, we've never really been able to represent ourselves. We've never been able to tell our own stories. And we have people like J.D. Vance, who crafts narratives about us with a very conservative political motivation. And on the other side of that, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, we have people like Silas House, who craft stories about us with a very liberal motivation, which is also politically motivated, that we're all Trump supporters. And so the best representation that we've had historically, and this is kind of what Cornel West says this about Black communities, has been through country music. Really, that's really the best representation that poor white people have had. Not that there aren't a lot of political problems and deplorable politics within country music, but those are really the only group of people that have really told our stories in a way that gives us dignity. And so I think it's important, though, that we create our own spaces first and foremost. I don't think we can keep showing up to middle class spaces and expect them to make room for us in a way that allows us to be represented as with joy the way we should be. And I know for myself, having dealt with a lot of nonprofits in Kentucky and going to Berea College and a lot of environmental groups who claim to represent us, at the same time, they never really allowed us to have a voice. And they were somewhat also embarrassed by us, right? And they didn't actually let us make decisions. And so I think it's important that we create our own spaces first and then invite folks in, because I think burning bridges can keep you safe. And I think it's important for poor white people to do that work among themselves first and foremost before we open that up to middle class people and co-option. I had an issue here recently. I like to use examples. We've been working on canceling rent in Kentucky, and we tried to build a large coalition around canceling rent. And what we had are a lot of NGOs and nonprofit leaders who pushed back on that and wanted to move toward rental assistance programs. And in thinking about that, a lot of people were shocked and so they ended up working with landlords and local government. And a lot of people in our group were kind of shocked that, these sort of liberal nonprofit leaders would prefer to work with landlords instead of, grassroots housing organizers. And we shouldn't be shocked by that, right? They are operating entirely within their class interest when they do that. It's not in their interest to cancel rent, right? And that's sort of the problem with liberalism, is it's always going to be based in reforming a system because they're actually benefiting from that system.
Yeah, I am overwhelmed by all that you have shared so far. It is a multiple day conversation that we're going to culminate in about 20 more minutes or so. Okay, I'm going to go in on this question because Josh, you led it here anyway. So I think let's talk about this widely held assumption, this narrative about all poor white folks voted for Trump, specifically here in our region, responsible for the rise of Mitch McConnell. Let's talk about those voting patterns in Kentucky. And just that, like that really widely held belief.
Yeah, so I'll jump in, and then I know these folks are gonna jump in as well, and I'm excited about that. But I would say I've registered hundreds of voters in Kentucky over years, and like in marginalized communities, and most poor people in rural communities do not vote. Like there are stats that prove that. I don't have them with me, but we can pull them. But I would say most poor people don't vote. Most poor people where I'm from don't vote. And so there's this like narrative that takes hold that like rural poor white people are to blame for Trump. They're to blame for Mitch McConnell. And not only is that just factually not true, and it's such a like simple explanation for something that is wildly more complex, and it's just also not true. But it's that, let's really look at who's to blame for these things. Like rich white people vote for Trump. They've created Trump. They've created McConnell. There is no story about Kentucky, about political analysis in Kentucky, about electoral politics in Kentucky without talking about organized mass amounts of money. Big business, the coal industry, big tobacco, and they create Trump, they create Mitch McConnell. And then there's like millions of dollars over time pumped into this region to make sure they hold power in those seats. And so there is no story about electoral politics or Trump country without any of that. And, also, there's this strategy that continues to go on where, we see that in Kentucky, often we're given, here are your choices. Basically, they're both Republicans. This one's labeled a Democrat, right? None of them are talking about healthcare for you and your family, for like a living wage that will actually like be material things in your life. And so we're constantly presented a choice of like voting against something horrible, which we are in November, voting against fascism. So I do want to acknowledge that is real. Or it's like, pick two people that really don't have your best interest at heart. Pick one of them. And then we're going to blame you for it when our candidate loses. And there's this like playbook that goes on where, it's like the Democratic Party is going to run someone to the right, meaning like I said, they're both Republican policies, but one's labeled a Democrat. And then when that person loses, then it comes back on blaming poor white people and blaming poor people of like, you're so stupid. You can't vote for, like, you vote against your self-interest kind of thing. And so we'll, whatever happens in November, we'll be blamed for it. Even though we saw a candidate this year, Charles Booker's campaign, who was talking to working class people across the state, who was talking about healthcare, who was talking to poor people, who a lot of us felt like he's one of us. And the National Democratic Party then, all the time, instead of listening to us, instead of like hearing what the people here wanted, and the candidate that we wanted to run against McConnell pumped all this money into the Democrat that we have repeatedly said we didn't want as the candidate. And then if that doesn't work out, then we'll be blamed for it again. And then it's like, well, let's run that same strategy over and over and over, yet it has never won. So I'll stop there, but I will leave it there.
I kind of want to pick up on a couple of threads, Beth, on what I was hearing from you. One thing is like this idea of voting against your self-interest. That is something that only gets said when we're talking about poor and working class white people. And intuitively, we kind of understand what it's a hidden argument. It's very hidden, and it's pretty gross, right? But in the same situation, we can look at Warren Buffett and say, you're voting against your self-interest. Oh, but he votes for Democrats. Well, why would somebody as rich as Warren Buffett vote for Democrats? That's against his self-interest. But nobody says that about him, right? So this voting against your own interest is only something that ever gets discussed when we're talking about poor and working class white people. And that's just like, to me, indicates that it's a bad faith kind of like critique. Even if there is something valuable underneath there, I don't know what it is, but it is only brought up in certain cases. Just the other thing is, I kind of want to like lay some of the responsibility for this not at like poor and working class communities, but at both national parties, like intentionally designed strategies. So a lot of folks like that I'm like running around with, in like, activist kind of spaces and stuff, we talk a lot about the Southern strategy, right? And that was like a Republican strategy, and Republican strategist Lee Atwater has been really upfront about this, doing it on purpose, of like, we have to create racist dog whistles so we can be racist and overt and pretty kind of overtly racist, but we have to say it in a way where we're not using racial slurs, because you'll lose if you use racial slurs. So we have to talk about forced busing. We have to talk about tax reform, like right-leaning tax reform and stuff like that. I mean, interestingly, like busing, like that issue has a lot to do with like policies that came out of Kentucky specifically. But that was like the Republican Southern strategy of like, let's develop dog whistles where we can get white people to hear the racialized message, but not say it directly. I mean, I think looking at like what the National Republican Party is doing now, like maybe that dog whistle thing is out the window and they're not even trying to hide it anymore. But what often doesn't get talked about is around the same time, like independently and kind of like jointly developed, was a Democratic national strategy of abandoning poor and working class rural communities. Like there was an intentional design by the National Democratic Party to identify our new basis of power. Our new locus of where our constituencies are and where you can find them is on the coasts. So like the Republicans did not just win out like the South and the Midwest and stuff on their own. It was also like this new political realignment where like the South is not longer a Democratic stronghold, and increasingly it's strange in the Midwest and the Rust Belt too. But that was because the Democratic Party wanted to develop, and for good reasons, right? The communities on the coasts, and in the cities and stuff like that deserve political representation too. But the unintended consequences of that was developing a party strategy and a party infrastructure in a way that centered solely and specifically focusing on the coasts. And people don't want to like take the Democratic Party to task for that, because every time like something doesn't go their way and stuff, they try and do like a reevaluation of like, well, here's an audit of what happens. And there's always people of like, well, now we want to revive like a rural strategy and fight in these areas. And I think that those are good efforts, but a lot of times what they believe the upshot of that effort is supposed to be is, well, now we've got to be racist again, or we got to stop talking about race altogether. Right. And we can only ever talk about class in a certain way and never mention race or any of these other like wedge issues, which is not the lesson that they need to learn. The lesson that they need to learn is you have to talk about race and you have to talk about class.
Yeah. Okay, anything else on that subject before we go? We had another question come in.
Yeah, I'd like
Josh,
to say
please.
something. Yeah, I'd like to say something based on the idea that people don't vote in their interest. And I had a conversation with Bashir's campaign, about housing. And one of the things I told them that they had trouble understanding was that they share a lot more in common with Matt Bevin than they did with me or my family or people I grew up around. And that was sort of this pearl clutching moment for them, because in their mind, they're sort of the antithesis of that. But within the entire political spectrum, they probably fall just to the right of center. Bevin falls, much farther right. But for someone like myself, I mean, if you think about the political spectrum internationally, they're really not the left, right? And so we get, a government of a Bashir administration that's perfectly content sending the National Guard into the west end of Louisville to murder a resident, but yet he's sort of held up as this liberal hero, right? And so we don't really do a good job when we talk about what our interests actually are. And so there was a really interesting thread yesterday on Twitter between Silas House and someone named Haz Zorbanak, who I don't know, but I think Beth and Michael know. So some really good statistics were thrown out to Silas in regards to an article he wrote about how, people in Appalachia vote for Trump when, the statistics say we actually don't vote. It's not Trump country, but yet he clung to the narrative that that's who we are. And so, and I think it's important to point out that real people who support Trump are very visible in their support of Trump. And so recently I bought a table on Craigslist from a fairly wealthy, upper middle class family. And I drove out to buy the table and I'm talking to them. And I think they probably saw me as the Trump supporter because I drive a 1995 F-150. I've got tattoos. They're probably, in my mind, that I probably look like what they think of as a Trump supporter. So they started telling me about their love of Trump, even though they have sort of like liberal ideology. They talked about how they felt like they had to vote for Trump, even though they were somewhat embarrassed by it, and they vote for him very privately because they got a much larger tax return because they voted for Trump. And those are the Trump supporters in the suburbs and the wealthier suburbs that we don't actually see, and we don't identify those folks as Trump supporters because they're not open about that. But it's entirely within their economic interest to vote for Trump, and that's what they were talking about. And so I get asked the question a lot in regards to Mitch McConnell, why do your people or why do people on there vote for Mitch McConnell? And I think it's important when you look at the entire career of Mitch McConnell, he was incubated and produced by the Louisville elite. There are a lot of articles that document this. David Jones Sr., the founder of Humana, really invested in McConnell's political career and benefited from that political career through a series of earmarks to the Humana Corporation for decade after decade. Same thing with the Brown family. But in Kentucky, we don't have a narrative that really indicts the Brown family or the Jones family as creating Mitch McConnell. And instead we vilify and demonize people in Eastern Kentucky for supporting Mitch, right? And if you think about Eastern Kentucky, I think it's important to look at it as an occupied territory. These are places that are wholly owned and controlled by coal companies. There's a large degree of voter suppression. There's a large degree of voter fraud. And that's what keeps producing, is very much a product of the elite interest of Oldham County and Jefferson County, not Eastern Kentucky.
Yeah, I kind of want to pick up a thread on Josh, you were talking about thinking about Eastern Kentucky as an occupied territory can be illuminating. One way that I've heard that talked about is that certain places in Appalachia are treated with a colonial logic, and that's to make clear that it actually is a colonized land. This is indigenous land that has been colonized, and most of the folks who are there now are the descendants of colonizers and are continuously colonizing the land that we do occupy now. But the colonial logic kind of thing is well, this land is rich in or historically has been rich in natural resources, coal and timber, tobacco, agriculture that you can grow and stuff like that. So go in, exploit those natural resources, exploit the workers that you can. When you extract every last dime of value you can out of the people and the land, then you just throw them out like trash. And that's I think that's a really helpful thing to keep in mind about the racial history of how the United States has been colonized, as well as how capitalism leverages colonial logics to continue screwing people.
Yeah. All right, we have, I think we have time for one more question. So let's end it on this question about what do you love? So of course, there are many conversations around the issues what is something that you love about Appalachian, Kentucky, and the South, and the history, and how does that make the case for and add to all of the work that you're doing right now?
I'll just go real fast on this. What I love, and Beth and Michael are doing this, and it's so inspiring and emboldening, is to see poor people represented with dignity, and see poor people allowed to control their own narratives with a lot of dignity in that.
I will say that something I really love about our culture, and it's like Southern culture and Appalachian culture, is that we are the best like storytellers. We tell the best jokes. We are very like fun and joyful people. And so when I think about organizing, like community organizing and building like true human solidarity, it's about relationships. It's about trust. It's about sharing stories. We build that dignity because we tell stories about our grandparents. Like my great grandparents, some of them I didn't get to meet, but I know stories of them, right? And I can be proud of them. And that's how you start to build trust and relationships. To organize is that we sit with another person and we share who we are. And then you also have fun and you like transform yourselves through that. But it's like stories and laughter and good people. And a lot of those strengths and relationships are, so I think about like my family, and just, or, we opened with the question, who are your people? Right. And so, in my family, I might be like, for example, like, God, my brother got on my nerves so bad today. I'm so pissed, right? And then someone 5 minutes later will be like, your brother really pissed me off. And I'm like, don't talk about my brother, right? So like we have this fierce like loyalty and fight within us. And so like I think that lends itself to being like, who are our people, right? Like us as like poor Appalachian, working class Appalachian white people, and Black folks in the West End of Louisville with Black Lives Matter Louisville. And so we fight for each other. And like we are in the fight of our lives right now. And so I think building on that, who are our people, who are our families, and fighting for each other is something I really love.
Yeah. I think for me, some of the things that I love the most and like my most cherished memories that like I hold so tightly are around music. I mean, it's deeply, deeply profound, like musical tradition across the South. You name any genre, and we've had a part to play in that. But to me, like country music is just very impactful. Keith Whitley, Dolly Parton, just keep going down the list and stuff like that. And why I think that has been important for me is I grew up in a very musical family. My dad played music, but everybody else in my family were dancing fools. So I remember, even if we didn't have much or whatever, on a Friday night or Saturday night and stuff, we'd like push the coffee table out of the way in the living room and like turn on the stereo and like dance around like as a huge family. And this is like a family where it's like, oh, okay, we live in this house, and then like relatives live in the house beside us and stuff like that, and we'd all like converge at like in my mama's house and dance. And I remember being really young and like learning how to dance from my mama. She taught me like how to jitterbug and stuff like that. And if you would put on Elvis, and she would just like have like the best weekend of her life, smoke cigarettes, have a beer, and just have like a little party. And that was always really fun. But kind of why I think it's important to the work that I do now, the organizing work, is, and I'm going to like plug this again because I learned it from the folks at the Highlander Center, is if you can't sing together, you cannot build revolutionary struggle together, like just period. And that sounds like maybe like a nice, like just way of saying like, okay, well, music is really important to movement. But one of the reasons for me why I think it's important is like it teaches you to put yourself in the present, right? And it forces you to acknowledge, like when you're dancing or when you're singing or when you're playing music, that like there is a moment that we're in right now, and it is joyful and it is beautiful, and it's about connection, and it's about like feeling together in the room, where something like a song like connects us, and something like a dance like brings us together, and you literally meet new people. Like you offer your hand to somebody and like, oh, ask them, would you like to dance to this song? And it builds such a strong and powerful community, that it's those moments that we create that bring joy into movement, that makes the people that are a part of a movement, it makes us resilient, it makes us happy, and it makes us powerful. And I just think that music is a very revolutionary force for those reasons. And I think that the Kentucky and Appalachian musical traditions of all kinds like have a part to play in that.
Yeah, well said. But these conversations are not separate of joy. This work is a path to greater joy, actually. Thank you all. This is a really wonderful conversation. We're going to end there. And thank you all who joined us today, who were able to donate. And we will see you next week, Wednesday, 4 p.m. We will be talking about emergent technology. All right. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody.